Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I will try to keep you awake and interested. And I first want to start by taking you back to Venice in the year 1502, where the printer Aldus Manutius saw a business opportunity. He saw these small pocketbooks of literature that were handwritten in the italic style of script. And he thought, oh, I could use type technology to make books that looked close to what those books were like. I could sell a lot of copies and make a lot of money. And so he had the punch cutter, Griffo, cut the first italic type. More on the way. Now, how did this independent style become so integrated into our visual language and our written language as well? And how, and I want to explore some of those questions this morning, both how it evolved, what its use is currently today, and what its potential future might be. A future that may extend beyond the Latin script. Now, within 20 years of that first italic, others began to appear. A repeat here for a completely different purpose. Large books that of poetry with a lot more space. So the design was different. You have long ascenders, long descenders, and used for that purpose. But the purpose was still independent. A whole book was printed in the italic script, not mixed. Add another 20 or so more years, and you see the script beginning to be mixed with the upright, used for mixed documents like dictionaries, typically, where you have the upright is one language and the italic is another, as blackletter had been used to some extent in the same similar way. In other words, these are different voices. You know, italic was used for a separate voice than the upright. They're still quite separate, but this time we do see the first italic that was designed to match the body size of an upright type. So they could be mixed together more easily. Well, within another 50 years, this mixing was quite common. And you see all sorts of different ways of doing it and different purposes, but still predominantly separate voices, author, editor, text and commentary, English, French, things like this. But that separation of voices was beginning to change. And we see this by the middle of the next century, by the middle of the 1600s, that it began to be used within text for things like vocal emphasis. Monkson, back in 1683, mentions its use for vocal emphasis, and that continued through literature. We see it in Bronte, we see it in Dickens, and we see it today. So italic was used sort of to mimic emphasis in speech, and I'll give you an example of this. The difference in these sentences and their meaning based upon the italic or based upon the emphasis. I never said we should kill him. 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 These are vastly different meanings, and vocally, but also typographically. But by 1700, this independent style had become subservient to the upright and had become so inextricably linked that we see the first experiments on designing an italic based on the design of the Roman. This is a romantic line. And this kind of rationalization of letter forms led to this mechanical, mathematical sloping to create an italic with other little tiny changes. But that experiment was the first to kind of indicate how much italic had become an alternate, a secondary, a subservient script to Latin or to the upright. Over time, that types of use began to expand and expanded rapidly. In fact, by the mid 1700s, we see complaints from style manuals about its overuse. It began to be used for ship names, book names, place names, even proper names for people. It was dotting the page all over, and there were complaints about it. Well, by now, this use has expanded greatly into both typographic and linguistic uses for italic. Now we see this sort of mix in this example from Bringhardt's Elements of Typographic Style. We see two examples of it being used for typographic purposes, for navigation, as a running section title, as well as a hierarchy for a section heading. But we also see it used in the text for linguistic purposes. The name of a play, the use of a term that is then defined. And this mixing is now commonplace today. But it's interesting to note that style manuals in the 20th century began to recognize that specifying the use of italics within a body of text was the job of the editor, not the typographer. Whereas used for typographic purposes, well, the typographer and designer had a choice of what to use for headings, etc. But if the italics was in the text, that was the job of the editor. It was part of the language purpose, not the typographic purpose. Now, Bacek calls this a type of linguistic marking that works differently than bold or italic. And David Crystal gives some good examples of how even italics are even used to change the semantic meaning of a word. Lost my red slippers versus I've lost my red slippers, as opposed to the blue ones. Right, now that has a little bit of vocal emphasis difference there. But what about, I have been reading about America in the paper versus I've been reading about America in the paper. Vocally, there's no difference. But this is a difference in text between talking about the country and talking about the book by Alistair Cook. Those are two different things. The only difference here is italics. So by this time, italic has evolved to have both typographic and linguistic uses. But how is it visually evolved? It was originally, 500 years ago, cursive handwritten style. But now we see italics, which are a very broad range of different design types, have a wide range of visual characteristics. Most are slanted. That's what we mostly think of when we think of italics. But they tend to have a cursive feel. Some are calligraphic or informal. Others feel very dynamic. Others have very strong basis in tools, things like this. But they're not always these things. In fact, italics are not always slanted. In fact, typed together here, created Literata a few years ago, an upright italic. And they weren't the first. Experiments in upright italics go back over 100 years. So there's no, solid definition of what that can be. In fact, we have now a growing interest in backslanted italics. And some families have multiple italics for different purposes. What about the current use of italics? Now you may think that over the last couple of decades, italics has mightily reduced in use because primarily the importance of text communication, starting at SMS messaging and other messaging and Twitter and WhatsApp, modes of communication that did not include any ability to silent with italics, for example. However, looking at all the tweets from November 2015 that mentioned italics shows over 40 different methods that people used within the plain text tweets to do italics, to express themselves using italics. And some of these are quite interesting and fun. But some have become de facto standards, like use underscores before and after a word. That's kind of part of the markdown, or asterisks between them. So people felt that italics were so useful, they couldn't be without it, even in text-only medium. What about print? Italic is not disappearing in print, certainly, especially not in fiction books. And an informal study of the use of italic in English language bestsellers and award winners from 2022 showed that 98% of them use italics. And 58% of them use italics in multiple linguistically significant ways. Some of those, by the way, were translated into English, and you might wonder, well, okay, what about those translated? Is it just an English language phenomenon? Well, every one of those books that were translated used italics in some way. So it's not just limited to English. And one award-winning novel, A Memory Called Empire, used italics for over 20 different purposes throughout the book. 20 different purposes. So italic does not seem to be disappearing, it's just too useful. It's still viable, it's still popular, certainly for English and European languages as much as ever before. So what about the future? For English language at least, and for Latin text, it's increasingly being supported. So we see things like WhatsApp that did not have italics at first, but back in 2016 added the ability to do italics, and more software are switching to being able to support rich text, including italics. But the more interesting area is for scripts other than that, in the future of italic for those. For many scripts, there is an interest in having additional secondary styles that go beyond just bold, right? And italics are something that has some of the characteristics of italics. Is a potentially useful style. Now, this is also not new, in that we take a look at when this I button began to appear in word processors, along next to this B button. Well, just because you were using a different script doesn't mean you couldn't use the I button, right? You pushed it, you got something that was slanted, mathematically slanted, and somewhat distorted in many cases. But people saw that. They began to use it. They found it useful. And it became very well accepted in many cases. Now, the type community, including myself, had mixed reactions to this. And I will admit that in my italics research, I was motivated many years ago. Part of my motivation was to try and get rid of these things and replace them with something better. What better was is another question. But the thing is, slanted forms actually have a lot of scripts have a history in slanted forms. The Tamil script we think of as upright now, but it only became upright when printing was established. It was originally a slanted script. And a lot of scripts have their heritage in manuscripts and otherwise with some slant, with some characteristics of italic, that sort of calligraphic styles, as a part of their heritage of the script that goes way before printing began. There's also the influence of European typography on a growing body of skilled local typographers. And by local, I mean people who use the script every day, no matter where they're located physically. They read things like the elegance of typographic style. They look at other style names. They look online, they have greater access to that. And they say, hey, I want my script to have a rich typographic vocabulary like Latin does. And so there's more interest in experimenting with these other forms. Now, some have argued that italic for scripts other than Latin is sort of an inappropriate remnant of typographic and linguistic colonialism. Well, in some cases, they're kind of right. And that the technology that was brought in, that I button, made it so easy to create these slanted forms. Simple, easy, didn't cost anything, didn't cause any extra work, compared to how much more effort would have been to create more culturally based secondaries and integrate them into font families on a computer. That was, it was just the path of least resistance, really. So, although, yes, there was clearly some colonialism, like technology colonialism in this, it may have also been a natural adaptation, a natural evolution, part of that script's evolution. And in many cases, this is a decision that was made decades ago, generations ago in some cases. Now the use may be a little bit different. For example, Ben Mitchell points out that Thai italics are quite common, used a lot, but not so much for vocal emphasis, more for separating types of text. So the usage and the pattern and its place in the typographic vocabulary may be different for these other scripts. It's not necessarily the same. Now, design is also a factor. Okay, we have these different characteristics of italics, slanted cursiveness, calligraphic, things like this. Which of these characteristics sensibly apply to the script you're thinking of? For example, Arabic script. Which way would you slant it? That's not a crazy question. And I remember a discussion at the Grand Chan conference in 2015, of which I'm proudly wearing, between two very eminent and well-respected Arabic script designers who disagree completely on which way it should slant. But is slanting even appropriate? Well, maybe not. There are other options. What about a script like Buhid, which is strongly slanted to begin with? Do you slant it more? Or do you upright it? What would you do? And what about Chinese, Japanese, Korean that have a difference in directionality that they can use? And a difference in heritage, a difference in tools, something that's so very different from the Latin script. Are italic characteristics that we think is appropriate? And what about something like the Thai Viet script that has retained its calligraphic dynamic character to this day? How do you make it more calligraphic, more dynamic? Do you even need to? Is there a better way for it to use the second? So now I don't have time to show you a lot of examples here, but designers are doing some really creative work. In fact, some people are doing on what experimenting with what these italics for some of these scripts might look like. But again, I apologize that I don't have the time to show you a lot of that. But one thing that is interesting to note amongst these experiments that people are doing is they're really looking back and saying, is there a heritage of styles within this script that can be used to inform and inspire these italics? For example, one of the things that a number of Arabic designers are doing is looking to the Ruqqa style of Arabic as a potential secondary style to match Naskh. Now, is it italic? It's not slanted. No, but it has a dynamic quality. It has a slightly more informal quality. So it shares some of those ideas, some of those characteristics. Now it's interesting that if there's a kind of a connection to some historic style in the script, that may help its acceptance. A completely separate example of this is Latin and emoji. As we know, emoji has been very rapidly incorporated into our Latin script-based text communication. Very quickly accepted, even though it's really a foreign import. Well, why does that work? Well, if you think back, there is a heritage in the Latin script of using punctuation symbols to create little faces and other little symbols, emoticons. And there's even experiments that predate emoticons. So, in other words, bringing in this idea of these other symbols was probably a natural thing. It was an easy thing to accept. So, the long history of italics is a great example of script evolution, of a change of a take style that had an independent use all by itself, very limited, and its use expanded and changed, and is now an inextricable part of our typographic and our linguistic vocabulary. But for many scripts and other writing systems, the development of secondary styles is part of their script evolution. And some are looking to these italics, and I use that term very loosely. Some of the visual characteristics as inspiration for these styles. Now, the use may be different, and the may not be used to reflect as much linguistic things like vocal emphasis, things like that, as it is for the Latin script. But who knows? Generations from now, that may change. And that italics may begin to pick up a meaning sort of like it has in the Latin script as well, over many centuries of development. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Victor. That was very interesting. So I know you have the questions prepared. See one, two, so please.
Yeah, thank you. As you mentioned, one of the functions of italics is emphasis. I was wondering if you've given any thought to the relationship between that function and the language you're speaking or writing. The reason I ask is taking back your example of I never said we should kill him. So in French, we say him kill, le tuer. So the pronoun is put as a prefix before the verb. And my thinking is that because the pronoun is used as a prefix, it could not be possibly emphasized either in oral form, like le tuer doesn't mean anything, and we wouldn't be using italics either. So if you want to put the emphasis on him in French, you would actually double the pronoun and restate it in a different form after the verb. Le tuer, lui. In some sense, have him killed him. And yes, I'm sorry, French are weird like that. And then the second installment of the pronoun could be emphasized, but not the first one. It would sound really, really bizarre. So there is probably a relationship between emphasis and the syntactic construction of the language.
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the explanations why, just in my time, you find it in use typographically, but not so much linguistically. Different languages other than English may have very different kind of structures and mechanisms for emphasis, as you see it with French. And so for a lot of languages, the use of italics to somehow mimic that might be really odd or difficult or not make sense. Other questions?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if it is a question or more of a comment to see what you think about it, but do you think that when dealing with all the scripts beyond Latin, let's say, it would be convenient to remove the sense of slant from the definition of what an informal hand or italic is? So let's say to approach the design from a perspective that does not include the act of slanting or not.
Yeah. Oh, certainly, yes. I think that's certainly, and that's why what we see is secondaries for other, scripts other than Latin may have some of those visual characteristics, but maybe not, and maybe only a couple of them. A sense of speed in writing, for example, or the use of a particular tool, or something. But not necessarily. So I think that the whole idea of italic does not equal slanted, that the horse has left that barn, as they say. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is anybody working on software that will automatically bold or italicize any script in the document, because that would save so much work and also solve this problem of it being Latin script centric.
In terms of synthesizing an actual design, taking the letter forms and making them bold or making them italic.
Yes.
Yeah, that's been around for many years. And there are whole techniques for, creating bold. Some of them are more automatic, some are more manual.
Okay.
I have on dissertation I could send you that talks about all these techniques, if you're interested.
Interesting, yeah, because I'm thinking like, I'll get to where it will become like a one button click for everything. It just looks at the script and actually creates the italicized or bold version on the fly, because that doesn't exist yet.
Well, what exists right now is the I button. It does it already. It creates a slanted thing. But the question is, if you have a script that has no italic design for it, and you just hit that I button, is the slanting, is that appropriate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
In fact, one person I was looking at some discussion of Georgian italics. And some people were saying, oh, well, it's not appropriate. Georgia doesn't have italics, things like this. And then a Georgian typographer spoke up and he said, actually, we use them all the time. Our kids know about them in school. And the reason why Georgian fonts tend not to have italics is because type designers are lazy. Okay?
Yes, makes sense.
Okay.